By late 1814, the War of 1812 had become a contradiction. In Europe, diplomats were trying to end it. In North America, armies were still preparing to fight. The United States had survived the burning of Washington, held Baltimore, stopped the British invasion at Plattsburgh, and endured the strain of blockade and political division. Britain had defended Canada, punished the Chesapeake, and failed to force the decisive victory that would let it dictate a harsh peace. At Ghent, American and British negotiators worked through a war that neither side had truly won. The British had entered talks with larger ambitions, including demands shaped by native alliances and the idea of a protected native buffer in the Old Northwest. But diplomacy follows power. After Baltimore and Plattsburgh, Britain no longer had the leverage to force those terms. The American negotiators were not united in personality, but they were united in one essential goal: no surrender of national territory and no British-controlled native barrier inside the continent. John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, Albert Gallatin, James A. Bayard, and Jonathan Russell brought different temperaments to the table, but together they defended the Republic's territorial future. For native nations who had fought beside Britain, this was the great betrayal hidden inside the peace. Tecumseh was dead. The Creek world had been devastated. The British had encouraged native resistance when it served imperial defense, but now the empire was tired, Europe mattered more, and London was not willing to continue the war for a native homeland south of the Great Lakes. On December 24, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent was signed. Its terms were strikingly modest. Conquered territory would be restored. Commissions would settle boundary questions. The great maritime grievances that had helped bring on the war, including impressment, were not directly resolved in the treaty. But the wider European war had changed the context. With Napoleon defeated, the old maritime crisis was less urgent. The treaty did not instantly end fighting. News still had to cross the Atlantic. Ships still sailed under wartime orders. Commanders still acted on old plans. In an age before telegraphs, peace could exist on paper while armies marched toward bloodshed. That is why the final famous battle of the War of 1812 would be fought after the treaty was signed. The destination was New Orleans. For Britain, New Orleans was a prize of enormous strategic meaning. It guarded the mouth of the Mississippi River, the commercial artery of the American West. If Britain could seize it, even temporarily, it might gain leverage over the Mississippi Valley and the Gulf Coast. For Americans in Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, and the Mississippi Territory, the river was not distant geography. It was the route by which farms, towns, and futures reached the world. Andrew Jackson understood this. He had just emerged from the Creek War with a reputation for relentless command. Horseshoe Bend and the Treaty of Fort Jackson had made him a powerful figure in the South. Now he faced a new test, defending a diverse, exposed, strategically essential city at the edge of empire. New Orleans was not simply American or French or Spanish or Caribbean. It was all of those things at once: Creole, enslaved, free black, immigrant, Catholic, commercial, multilingual, and wary of outside authority. To defend it, Jackson would have to gather regular soldiers, militia, sailors, free men of color, Choctaw allies, local volunteers, and even smugglers whose loyalty had recently been uncertain. Peace had been signed at Ghent, but on the Gulf Coast, the war was about to roar one last time. While Jackson prepared in the South, the United States faced a crisis of confidence in New England. The war had never been equally popular across the country. In the South and West, many supporters saw it as a defense of honor, commerce, and expansion. In New England, many Federalists saw it as a reckless Republican war that damaged trade, strengthened political enemies, and exposed coastal towns to ruin. The British blockade hurt commerce. The national government struggled with money. Militia disputes raised constitutional questions. By late 1814, anger in New England had hardened enough to produce the Hartford Convention. Delegates from Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and parts of New Hampshire and Vermont met in secret in Hartford, Connecticut. Beginning in December, they discussed grievances against the Madison administration and proposed constitutional amendments meant to limit the political power of the South and West. Their complaints included restrictions on embargoes, declarations of war, admission of new states, and the 3/5 clause's effect on representation. Rumors made the convention sound more dangerous than the surviving record proves. Some Americans feared secession. The delegates did not formally call for it. But secrecy was politically disastrous. At the very moment Americans were about to celebrate New Orleans and receive news of peace, the Hartford Convention would be remembered as disloyal, sectional, and out of step with national feeling. The timing destroyed the Federalists. Before news of the Treaty of Ghent and New Orleans reached Washington, Federalist complaints still had force. The war had been costly, Washington had burned, the blockade had damaged the economy, the army had failed to conquer Canada. But once peace and victory arrived together in public imagination, the story changed. The war became proof that the Republic had stood up to Britain again. The Federalists looked as if they had doubted the nation at the moment the nation was proving itself. This mattered beyond party politics. The collapse of the Federalists helped open the so-called era of good feelings, when one-party Republican dominance obscured, but did not erase, deep conflicts over slavery, expansion, finance, and native land. The war's end did not create unity as much as it rearranged the arguments. New Orleans would become the emotional answer to Hartford. If Hartford represented division, New Orleans would be remembered as unity. If Hartford whispered of constitutional grievance, New Orleans would shout of flags, cannon, river mud, and frontier resolve. That memory was too simple, but it was powerful. It made Andrew Jackson a national hero and transformed a complicated war into a usable patriotic story. Yet even before the battle, New Orleans was not a neat symbol. It was a city built on slavery and commerce, defended by people with very different stakes in American power. Some fought for the Republic, some fought for local survival. Some fought because war gave them a chance to claim status, protection, or freedom. Some were forced by the structures around them. The Battle of New Orleans would be remembered as a miracle of national unity. On the ground, it was something more layered, an improvised coalition defending a borderland city from an imperial army. The British expedition against New Orleans began as part of a wider Gulf campaign. British forces had already probed the region. They had used Pensacola in Spanish Florida as a base of influence, working with native allies and threatening the American southern frontier. Jackson had marched against Pensacola in November 1814, forcing the British to withdraw and making clear that he would not tolerate Spanish neutrality when it shielded British operations. But Pensacola was only a prelude. The larger British aim was the Mississippi. A successful blow against New Orleans could threaten the American West, disrupt commerce, and perhaps strengthen Britain's position if peace terms remained unsettled. The British sent a major expedition under experienced commanders, including Admiral Alexander Cochrane, Vice Admiral Edward Codrington, Major General John Keane, and later Major General Edward Pakenham, a respected officer and the Duke of Wellington's brother-in-law. The approach to New Orleans was difficult. The city was protected by water, marsh, bayou, lake, and river. That geography could shield it or expose it, depending on who understood the routes. British ships entered Lake Borgne, east of the city. There, American gunboats under Thomas Ap Catesby Jones tried to delay them. The Americans were outnumbered and eventually overwhelmed, but the fight bought time. Time mattered. Jackson arrived in New Orleans and found a city anxious, politically divided, and vulnerable. He imposed martial law, a decision that would later become controversial, but in the moment he believed speed and discipline were essential. He recruited broadly. Louisiana militia, Tennessee riflemen, Kentucky militia, U.S. regulars, sailors, Marines, free men of color, Choctaw warriors, local Creoles, and Jean Lafitte's Baratarians all became part of the defense. Lafitte's role captured the strange politics of the Gulf. His Baratarians had been smugglers and privateers operating from the Louisiana coast. The British tried to recruit them. Lafitte instead offered support to the Americans, and Jackson, who needed artillerymen and local knowledge, accepted help from men he might otherwise have condemned. The British moved through difficult waterways and reached the Mississippi's east bank below New Orleans. On December 23, 1814, American forces launched a night attack against the British camp. The fighting was confused and fierce, but it disrupted British confidence. Jackson's men showed that the city would not be taken passively. After the night battle, Jackson chose a defensive position along the Rodriguez Canal, a ditch running from the Mississippi toward the Cypress Swamp. There he built Line Jackson. Earth, cotton bales, timber, mud, and labor became a wall. Cannon were placed to command the open ground. The Mississippi protected one flank, the swamp limited the other. The British faced a narrow battlefield. If they could break the line, New Orleans might fall. If they failed, their army would be trapped in a costly assault against prepared defenses. The final attack was coming. Line Jackson was not beautiful. It was practical, muddy, improvised, and deadly. Men worked with shovels, axes, carts, and whatever materials could be found. The Rodriguez Canal was widened and strengthened. Earthworks rose behind it. Artillery positions took shape. Sailors and Baratarians served guns. Riflemen found places along the line. Free black battalions, Louisiana militia, regulars, Tennesseans, Kentuckians, Choctaw allies, and local volunteers held a position that reflected the city's complexity. Jackson's command style was harsh and magnetic. He could inspire loyalty, but he also demanded obedience with little patience for hesitation. Martial law gave him sweeping authority over New Orleans. Some civilians resented it. Some feared it. Others accepted it as the price of survival. The British tested the line before the final assault. On January 1, 1815, they opened an artillery duel. British guns hammered the American defenses, but Jackson's artillery answered effectively. The defenders held. The British learned that the American line could not easily be battered into submission. Major General Edward Pakenham now faced a decision. He had disciplined troops, but the ground was terrible for attack. The open field before Line Jackson exposed advancing soldiers to artillery and rifle fire. The swamp and river limited maneuver. The plan required coordination across the river as well as a main assault on the east bank. Scaling ladders and fascines were needed to cross the ditch and climb the works. Any delay, confusion, or missing equipment could turn discipline into slaughter. On the American side, the defenders waited. Many were not professional soldiers. Some had marched hundreds of miles. Some had been hastily organized. Some spoke French or Spanish more readily than English. Some had been denied full citizenship or equality in the society they now defended. Yet the line gave them an advantage. Behind earthworks, with artillery placed well and the enemy forced across open ground, the defenders could turn diversity into firepower. The Battle of New Orleans is often remembered as a simple frontier victory. Jackson's riflemen cutting down British regulars. The truth is broader. Artillery was crucial. Terrain was crucial. Naval delays were crucial. Local knowledge mattered. The night attack mattered. Free men of color mattered. Baratarians mattered. Choctaw allies mattered. The city itself, with all its contradictions, mattered. Jackson did not win with one type of American. He won with a coalition that existed because New Orleans was a crossroads of empires. Before dawn on January 8th, British columns formed for the attack. The air was cold. Fog hung over the field. Men carried ladders, muskets, flags, and orders that depended on timing. Across the open ground, American guns waited. The last great battle of the war was about to begin. The British assault on January 8, 1815, went wrong almost from the beginning. The attack required coordination, but coordination failed. Some troops moved without the necessary ladders and fascines. The battlefield was exposed. Fog lifted. American artillery and small arms fire struck advancing formations. British soldiers kept moving with courage, but courage could not erase the geometry of the field. Pakenham tried to rally the assault and was mortally wounded. Other senior officers fell. Units pressed forward into a storm of fire, then broke or stalled before the American line. On the west bank of the Mississippi, British forces had more success against American positions. But the failure of the main attack made that success useless. The casualties were lopsided. British losses were severe. American losses behind the line were comparatively light. New Orleans held. The victory arrived at exactly the moment Americans needed a story of redemption. Washington had burned. The invasion of Canada had failed. The war had strained the economy and nearly broken national confidence. Now, at the mouth of the Mississippi, an American army under Andrew Jackson had destroyed a British assault and defended the West's commercial lifeline. News of the battle traveled with astonishing emotional force. By the time many Americans learned of New Orleans, they also learned that peace had been signed. In public memory, the two events fused. The treaty ended the war. New Orleans made it feel won. That distinction matters. The Treaty of Ghent did not mention New Orleans because it had already been signed. But politically, New Orleans transformed the meaning of the treaty. A status quo peace could now be celebrated as national vindication. The United States had not conquered Canada. It had not forced Britain to renounce impressment in writing. It had not achieved many of the goals war supporters had once imagined. But it had survived. It had fought Britain again. It had ended the war with a spectacular victory. Andrew Jackson became the embodiment of that memory. His fame would carry him from general to political icon, from New Orleans to the presidency. But the same qualities that made Jackson a wartime hero would later shape policies of coercion, expansion, and removal. New Orleans built the legend. The borderland wars that followed revealed what that legend would mean for native nations and for the South. The British withdrew from New Orleans, but the Gulf frontier did not become peaceful. The War of 1812 was ending between the United States and Britain. Yet in the southern borderlands, the violence had already become something else. A struggle over runaway slaves, native sovereignty, Spanish weakness, American expansion, and the meaning of security along a frontier no treaty had truly calmed. The cannons at New Orleans fell silent. The Borderland War continued. In February 1815, the Treaty of Ghent was ratified by the United States. The War of 1812 was officially over. Americans celebrated, but the peace had uneven meanings. Along the Atlantic coast, commerce could revive. In Washington, Madison's administration could claim survival. In the West and South, many people saw the war as proof that the Republic could defend its expansion. For veterans of New Orleans, the victory became a source of pride for decades. For native nations, the meaning was darker. The treaty restored territory between Britain and the United States, but it did not restore the political power native allies had lost. British support had receded. Tecumseh's Confederacy had been shattered. The Creek War had ended with a huge land cession. The demand for a native buffer state disappeared from the final peace. In the South, the Treaty of Fort Jackson cast a long shadow. Creek communities, including some who had not fought against the United States, were forced to give up vast lands. The settlement deepened resentment, displacement, and instability. Many Creek refugees moved south into Spanish Florida, joining or living near Seminole communities and other native groups. Spanish Florida became the unresolved frontier. Spain was weaker than it had once been. Its empire was strained by wars in Europe and revolutions in Latin America. Florida was thinly defended, difficult to govern, and entangled with native towns, maroon communities, British agents, traders, and American pressure. To U.S. officials and Southern slaveholders, Florida looked like a danger, a place where native resistance could regroup and enslaved people could flee beyond American reach. To many refugees, Florida looked like survival. Seminole identity itself was shaped by movement, alliance, and autonomy. The Seminoles were not simply one old nation standing still. They included native communities with Creek connections and other roots, building towns in a borderland where Spanish authority was limited and American power was still contested. Black Seminoles and other people of African descent, including fugitives from slavery, formed communities connected to Seminole towns through alliance, tribute, family, and mutual defense. This world terrified the slaveholding South. The end of the War of 1812, therefore, did not end war aims. It redirected them. American leaders increasingly treated Spanish Florida as a problem to be solved. Southern planters demanded security. Military officers watched the border. Native towns tried to preserve autonomy. Black refugees tried to defend fragile freedom. The next flashpoint stood on the Apalachicola River. Americans called it the Negro Fort. During the War of 1812, the British had built a post at Prospect Bluff on the Apalachicola River in Spanish Florida. When British forces withdrew, they left behind weapons, supplies, and a fortified position. The fort became occupied by people of African descent, many formerly enslaved, along with native allies and families. To those inside, it was a refuge and a defensive stronghold. To U.S. officials and Southern slaveholders, it was a nightmare. An armed black community near the border, connected to native resistance and beyond direct American control. Americans called it the Negro Fort. The name itself reflected white fear more than the community's full reality. The fort represented the possibility that enslaved people could escape, arm themselves, and survive with allies in the borderlands. In the slaveholding imagination, that possibility was intolerable. In 1816, U.S. forces moved against the fort. Gunboats ascended the river. The confrontation ended catastrophically when a heated shot struck the fort's powder magazine. The explosion destroyed the fort and killed many inside. The destruction of the fort was not only a military event, it was a signal. The United States would not tolerate armed sanctuary for fugitives from slavery near its southern border. The border between Georgia and Florida would be treated not simply as a line between nations, but as a zone where slavery, native sovereignty, and American expansion collided. The survivors and surrounding communities did not vanish from history. Black Seminoles, Red Stick refugees, and other borderland people continued to navigate danger, alliance, and movement. But the destruction at Prospect Bluff showed how violently the United States would respond when black freedom and native autonomy reinforced one another. After 1816, tensions deepened. Fort Scott became an American military post near the border. Fowltown, a Lower Creek village led by Nehemathla, resisted American claims and pressure. U.S. officers treated that resistance as a threat. The line between policing, retaliation, and invasion began to blur. Late in 1817, violence at Fowltown and attacks along the Apalachicola escalated into open conflict. The Scott Massacre, in which a U.S. boat carrying soldiers, women, and children was attacked on the Apalachicola, intensified demands for retaliation. Fear, revenge, and expansion now moved together. The United States called on Andrew Jackson. Jackson saw the Florida border in blunt terms. If Spanish authorities could not control native and black resistance from Florida, he believed the United States had the right to act. This logic would drive him beyond the border and into one of the most controversial military campaigns of his career. The First Seminole War was about to begin. In 1818, Andrew Jackson marched into Spanish Florida. He had orders to pursue hostile native forces, but his campaign quickly exceeded cautious limits. Jackson believed delay and diplomacy only protected enemies. His solution was direct force: strike towns, seize supplies, destroy sanctuaries, and confront the Spanish posts that, in his view, allowed the border war to continue. Jackson's army included U.S. regulars, Tennessee volunteers, Georgia militia, and allied native fighters. They moved through a landscape of rivers, pine woods, swamps, abandoned fields, and towns already strained by years of war and displacement. Seminole and Red Stick communities withdrew, scattered, or resisted where they could. The campaign was not a single clean battle. It was a hard march through a borderland society. Jackson destroyed the village of Miccosukee and other settlements. He pursued leaders associated with resistance. He treated Spanish neutrality as either weakness or deception. In April 1818, he seized the Spanish post at St. Mark's. There, two British subjects, Alexander Arbuthnot and Robert Ambrister, were captured and accused of aiding native resistance. Jackson had them tried by military tribunal. Arbuthnot was hanged. Ambrister was executed after a controversial proceeding in which the tribunal's sentence became entangled with Jackson's own will. The executions created an international crisis. Britain was at peace with the United States. Spain still owned Florida. Jackson had invaded Spanish territory, seized Spanish posts, and executed British subjects. To supporters, he had acted decisively against a dangerous frontier network. To critics, he had behaved like a military dictator. Jackson was not finished. He moved west and seized Pensacola, the capital of Spanish West Florida, after Spanish authorities protested but could not stop him. Once again, Jackson justified action by arguing that Spain had failed to control threats from its own territory. The campaign's military success was clear. Jackson had demonstrated that Spanish Florida could not resist American force. The political meaning was more explosive. Had he gone too far? Had he risked war with Spain and Britain? Had he violated orders? Or had he revealed a truth diplomats could no longer ignore? Spain could not hold Florida against American pressure. President James Monroe's administration faced a choice: Secretary of War John C. Calhoun privately wanted Jackson censured. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams defended him with cold strategic brilliance. Adams argued that Spain's inability to police Florida made American action understandable and that the real solution was for Spain to cede the territory. Jackson crossed the line with an army. Adams turned that crossing into diplomacy. The First Seminole War did not immediately annex Florida, but it made annexation feel inevitable. Spain protested Jackson's invasion, but Spain's position was weak. Its empire in the Americas was under pressure from independence movements. Florida produced more trouble than strength. It was expensive to defend, thinly settled by Spanish authority, and vulnerable to U.S. military action whenever Washington chose to act. John Quincy Adams used the crisis to press Spain. His argument was not sentimental, it was strategic. If Spain could not control Florida, and if Florida became a base for raids, fugitives, and foreign intrigue, then the United States would continue acting in self-defense. Better for Spain to negotiate than to watch Florida slip away by force. The result was the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819. Spain ceded Florida to the United States. In return, the United States assumed certain claims by American citizens against Spain and recognized Spanish claims to Texas, at least for the moment. The treaty also defined a boundary between U.S. territory and Spanish possessions stretching toward the Pacific. Florida's transfer was a major expansion of American power. It secured the southeastern coastline, tightened U.S. control over the Gulf, and removed a European buffer that had sheltered native and black communities from direct American rule. For white Southern slaveholders, this was a victory for security. For Seminoles, black Seminoles, and other borderland refugees, it was a warning. The line that once offered space for negotiation and refuge was closing. Spanish weakness had allowed a complicated world to survive. American sovereignty would bring roads, forts, land hunger, slave catchers, treaties, pressure, and eventually removal. The War of 1812 and the First Seminole War therefore belong in the same story. One ended with a treaty that restored borders between Britain and the United States. The other helped erase a border that had limited American power in the Southeast. One created the myth of New Orleans and national vindication. The other showed how that new confidence would be used against native nations and black refuge communities. Andrew Jackson stood at the center of both. At New Orleans, he defended the Republic. In Florida, he expanded its reach. To admirers, he was the man who protected American security when politicians hesitated. To those in the path of American power, he was the face of invasion, coercion, and dispossession. The age after the War of 1812 was not an age of peace for everyone. It was an age when victory became expansion. New Orleans became more than a battle almost immediately. It became a national story. Americans remembered the field below the city as proof that the Republic had matured. The details were complicated, but memory simplified them. A diverse defensive coalition became a symbol of one people. A battle fought after peace had been signed became the victory that seemed to win the war. A status quo treaty became a triumph. Andrew Jackson became the man who had done what the country wanted to believe it had done: stand firm, strike back, and humble Britain. Songs, speeches, newspapers, veteran stories, and political celebrations carried the battle into legend. The geography helped. New Orleans guarded the Mississippi, and the Mississippi represented the future. Western farmers, merchants, planters, and politicians could all understand what it meant for the river to stay open. The battle did not merely defend one city. In American imagination, it defended the West. The memory also helped cover over discomfort. The War of 1812 had been messy. The United States had invaded Canada and failed. Washington had burned. The blockade had exposed economic weakness. The army had often struggled. New England Federalists had opposed the war so strongly that Hartford became a political wound. The Treaty of Ghent restored the old boundaries without resolving many of the grievances that had originally animated the conflict. New Orleans made all of that easier to bear. The victory gave the war a clean ending in public memory, even though the actual ending had been negotiated in Europe. It allowed Americans to speak of the conflict as a second war of independence, a phrase that captured emotion more than diplomatic precision. Britain had not reconquered the United States. The Republic had survived. That was enough for national mythology, but mythology chooses what to emphasize. It emphasized Jackson, but often softened the coalition around him. It celebrated riflemen, but sometimes overlooked artillery. Sailors, free men of color, Creoles, Baratarians, Choctaw allies, enslaved laborers, and the city's complicated social world. It celebrated national defense, but often ignored the fact that many defenders lived inside a society that denied liberty to others. The myth was powerful because it was partly true. New Orleans really was a remarkable victory. The defenders really did hold under pressure. The British Army really did suffer a devastating defeat. Jackson really did impose order on a frightened city and turn geography into advantage. But the myth was dangerous because it made force look simple. It taught many Americans that decisive violence could solve borderland problems, that a strong commander could cut through hesitation, and that expansion could be framed as defense. That lesson would follow Jackson into Florida. To understand why Florida mattered so much after 1815, we have to see it as more than a Spanish possession waiting to become American. It was a refuge. For native communities pushed by war and land hunger, Florida offered distance from U.S. power. For Red Stick refugees after the Creek War, it offered a place to regroup beyond the immediate reach of American officials. For enslaved people fleeing plantations in Georgia, Alabama, and the Carolinas, it offered the possibility of freedom, protection, and alliance. For Black Seminoles and Maroon communities, it offered a world that was dangerous but not hopeless. That made Florida unacceptable to the slaveholding South. Slaveholders did not see the border as a neutral line. They saw it as a leak in the system of slavery. Every successful escape challenged property claims, racial control, and the authority of masters. When fugitives found weapons, families, farms, and native allies, the fear became political. Southern leaders demanded action not only against raids, but against the possibility of armed black autonomy. Native sovereignty and black freedom became linked in the minds of American officials. That link shaped the coming wars. U.S. leaders often described Seminole resistance as a security problem, but security meant many things at once. Stopping raids, recovering enslaved people, preventing British or Spanish influence, opening land, and proving that no community near the southern border could defy American power. Spanish officials could not satisfy these demands. They lacked the soldiers, money, and local authority to police Florida the way Washington and Southern planters wanted. Seminole towns did not simply obey Spanish orders. Black refuge communities had their own interests. Traders, British agents, and local power brokers moved through the region in ways that made formal sovereignty look thin. This was the borderland reality Jackson entered. He did not invent the pressures. The Creek War, the War of 1812, slavery, Spanish weakness, and American expansion had already created them. But Jackson gave those pressures a military form. He believed sanctuary across a border was not a shield. He believed weak sovereignty did not deserve respect if it endangered American security. He believed speed and punishment could accomplish what diplomacy delayed. The First Seminole War was therefore not a random postscript. It was the War of 1812's southern aftermath. The same Gulf world, the same anxieties over British influence, the same Creek displacement, the same American hunger for land and security, and the same unwillingness to accept native or black autonomy when it blocked expansion. The United States had won its patriotic ending at New Orleans. Now it would decide what victory permitted. By 1819, the United States had changed. It had survived a second war with Britain. It had celebrated New Orleans. It had watched the Federalist Party collapse. It had pressed Spain towards ceding Florida. It had seen Andrew Jackson become one of the most famous men in the country. But the deeper changes were still unfolding. The war strengthened a national story of resilience, but it also accelerated the destruction of native power in the East. Tecumseh's Confederacy was gone. The Creek Nation had been forced into devastating cessions. Seminole autonomy now faced the direct pressure of the United States. Black refugee communities in Florida had learned that American slavery would pursue them beyond old borders. The United States emerged from the war with confidence that its future lay west and south. Roads, cotton, land speculation, slavery, military posts, and treaties would push into native homelands. The federal government would speak the language of civilization, security, and legality. Settlers would speak the language of opportunity. Armies would arrive when words failed. Jackson's rise mattered because he embodied that future. His supporters saw him as the defender of New Orleans, the conqueror of chaos, the man who acted when others debated. His critics saw danger in his willingness to impose martial law, invade foreign territory, and execute men under controversial authority. Both views were part of the same figure. Jackson's appeal came from the same force that made him frightening. For the epic history recap story, Episode 3 is the hinge. It closes the War of 1812 as a formal conflict between the United States and Britain. It opens the next phase of the Indian Wars as a struggle over the southern borderlands. The battlefield shifts from New Orleans to Florida. The enemy shifts from British regulars to native towns, black refuge communities, and Spanish weakness. The language shifts from national defense to frontier security. But the momentum is continuous. New Orleans gave Americans a heroic ending. The First Seminole War showed what came after the applause. Florida became American. The Seminoles remained unconquered. Black Seminole communities adapted and endured. The questions left unresolved would return with even greater force in the years ahead. The next chapters of this series will move deeper into the age of removal. The pressure on native nations in the Southeast, the rise of Jacksonian democracy, the Indian Removal Act, and the long road toward the Second Seminole War. The War of 1812 ended with a flag, a treaty, and a hero. Its aftermath began with a border crossing, and on that border, the future of the United States came into focus. Powerful, confident, expanding, and impossible to separate from the people it pushed aside.